So without further ado, I'd like to present our first speaker, Javier Ramos Rodriguez. Javier has almost 25 years experience as a programmer and has worked with large multinationals such as Oracle, IBM and Cisco. And today finds himself as a senior software engineer with AYLIEN, a progressive startup focused on machine learning, NLP and AI based in Dublin. Today, Javier will be discussing with us his presentation for Kubernetes and serverless or versus serverless. And on that note, I pass over to Javier to kind of take it over.
Okay, thank you for taking your time, lunchtime, for this presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about serverless and Kubernetes. So 2 options to run your production workloads. But if you could run the poll, I want to get a feedback from the users. See where are you running now, your workloads, which cloud provider. That will give me some context for the presentation. So that if you get the poll, please start voting and we'll review it later. So basically about me, well, Sean already mentioned, I work in many companies and now I'm working at AYLIEN. Just to mention that we are hiring at the moment. So we do mainly NLP, machine learning. We work in the big data field. We do a lot of stream processing and we are heavy users of Kubernetes and through DevOps, and we also use Scala and Akka. So really great tech. So if you are interested, please contact me after the meeting. I also Medium.com ITNS contributor. I write blogs regularly regarding DevOps and lots and big data. And you find my contact details there if you want to add me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Medium, and you can follow my blogs. So basically, this talk is based on an article. There's the link on these slides. We'll share the slides later. And it talks about the pros and cons of running your workloads in serverless and Kubernetes, right? And the different use case that can point you to one or the others. So we'll start by a quick introduction, right, for people who maybe don't have the context. And then we'll talk about the serverless journey, usually how people go into serverless, and the Kubernetes journey, how people actually get into Kubernetes, the most common scenario. Of course, each company is different. And then we'll go through the pros and cons and use cases, right? Okay, so mainly AWS users, as I expected. Thanks for voting. So basically, just the second poll is Azure. Just to give you a bit of context, I will basically be comparing mainly AWS with GCP, which is the providers I have most experience with. But if anyone wants to mention anything about Azure, if there's any technology that could solve this problem, please feel free to do so, right? So mainly I will comparing AWS and GCP. But most of you are familiar with AWS, so you should be fine. Okay, so let's start. Well, the introduction, everybody knows this graph. There are different levels of abstraction. On-prem, you have to manage all the physical machines. Then you have infrastructure as a service, where you have the fixed set of bare metal, and then you just manage virtual machines. And the next level of abstraction is containers, where you have this abstraction of your libraries and code bundling in containers. And then you have the platform as a service offerings like in the terms of each cloud provider has its own type of platform as a service, so you'll be familiar with one. And then the next level is serverless. Serverless sits at the same level as platform as a service, but it's more event-driven, right? So there's a bit of confusion. So just to clarify, for me, I will be calling serverless anything that doesn't require any operations, any servers, right? So if offering is a completely managed database, I'll be mentioning that as serverless, right? Many people call serverless function as a service. For me, serverless is a superset. So function as a service is a part of serverless, right? Just if there's any confusion, just be clear that serverless is anything that you don't have to manage absolutely anything, right? So how do you end up using serverless? So usually I've been working in many kind of big tech companies, and recently I moved to startups. So I see serverless as a really great way for startups to achieve good time to market. Um, and the idea is that you start with some quick idea, wireframes, spec, then you build a proof of concept. You want to fail fast, focus on the core features. It's okay to rewrite code, right? And you start by maybe using JavaScript frameworks to build something fast, and then some backend as a service like in Google Firebase or AWS Amplify, right? You just want to do maybe a mobile app or a web app, right? Then for MVP, you start adding more features like authentication, authorization, monitor. But as your app scales and gets bigger and bigger, backend as a service is not enough, right? That's when serverless comes into play because you need event-driven workloads. You need to do some batch operations, right? And as I mentioned, serverless is a way to allow and empower developers to get production-ready workloads without managing absolutely anything. So that's how you get into a final product. For me, serverless offerings in the cloud allow you to have production-ready products that can scale to millions of users without managing absolutely anything, which is great. This is the dream of a developer, right? So this is how you ended up there. Kubernetes is a bit different, right? Kubernetes, the most common use case, although there are many use cases, this is the most common. It's basically your legacy app going to the cloud. Usually you have this big monolith that are hard to scale, hard to manage. So then you start splitting into microservices. This happened already years ago. Companies start moving to microservices. And then from that, they start using Docker to run consistent workloads across different environments. And these abstractions allows them a simpler migration to the cloud. But then you have lots of these microservices. So then is when you enable Kubernetes. And once you have Kubernetes on-prem, or you even have Docker or microservice on-prem, it's very easy to migrate to the cloud. So that's then the use case of Kubernetes allows you to do hybrid development. You can have on-prem and cloud-based workloads and have all the orchestration managed for you on the cloud. And you have the deployments, load balances, security, scaling. So you could have control on your system. That's something you give up in serverless, and it's much easier to move from on-prem if you migrate to Kubernetes first. So this is a very common journey. Another one that I'm seeing now is actually Kubernetes could be very cost efficient thanks to the cloud providers using long-term discounts, spot instances, and so on. Kubernetes is very good at running and this type of VMs that are very cheap to run. So I'm seeing more and more often moving from serverless to Kubernetes in order to be more cost efficient. So we'll talk about that. Kubernetes could be very cost efficient, depends on your workloads. And we're gonna talk now about this. So let's discuss first serverless, right? Serverless is great for time to market. You can develop very quick. For developer productivity, it's easy to learn, use, manage. It's also event driven, so you can do quite easy, complicated workflows, and it's also integrates with many services. So basically, providers make it very easy to get started with AWS Lambda or Cloud Functions in GCP. Because then you they kind of push you to use the other services. It's really easy to also secure them and call all the services in the cloud. So it's based on the cloud, right? And you don't have any operation, so no need for specialized operation teams. You don't need to build any monitor solution. It can scale as much as you want. And it has a pay-as-you-go model. So think about serverless pay-as-you-go, event-driven. So the idea of pay-as-you-go is it's very good for time to market. You don't have to worry about the initial cost, and you can scale as much as you want. So it's great for startups. It can handle unpredictable load. It scales really fast. And of course, because it's pay-as-you-go, you don't have any cost while your functions are not running. In terms of the cons, you have lower flexibility. Each cloud provider has some certain limitations on languages and runtime. It's not suitable for certain use cases like Lambda for stateful or more real-time processing when you want really low latency. It's event-driven paradigm, so it's not that easy to learn, or it might not fit your need. Debugging could be difficult, although it's getting better. Integrations with that are not out of the box could be complex. In terms of operational, you have the vendor lock-in. So this is very critical. I always see serverless as a cloud solution, right? I know there are efforts in Kubernetes to run serverless and other solutions. Probably you are aware of those, but they are still in early stages and still think of serverless as a cloud. And although it's becoming easier to avoid vendor lock-in, that's something that you have to accept when you will go serverless. The security is delegated to the provider. You don't have much control there, so you have to trust the cloud provider. It might not be, this may be quite problematic for some companies, especially insurance and banks. And there's no separation between infrastructure and code, right? Many teams, they have this DevOps approach where they have SREs dealing with certain parts. You have everything now in function, so it's a bit tricky in the sense that you will have Terraform files or Ansible to deploy all these functions and buckets and different things. But there's no separation, meaning what you call infrastructure in a Terraform file. Is a Lambda function definition infrastructure, or is code, right? So there's not layer where you usually have in Kubernetes, where you have services that's the code, and infrastructure, which is basically load balancers and clusters. From the financial aspect, as I said, serverless is great for time to market, but be careful because it could become expensive because of the integrations. So for example, in AWS, Lambda is very cheap, but API Gateway is not cheap. Kinesis is not cheap. Other AWS services, SageMaker, you start adding services because it's very easy, and that could become very expensive, especially depends on your load. So if you have spikes, if you are in retail, it could be a great option. But if you have a steady load, it could become expensive. Again, I like this picture because if you need to ping your Lambda function every 15 minutes to make sure it's always warm, as you know, it's event driven, so it scales down to 0. But if you need to do something like this that I've seen many times, because you just want a front end service, you may not need serverless, right? Because you are not doing anything event driven. You just doing a front end, a REST service that needs to be available all the time. So this is a clue that you may not need serverless. Okay, let's go really quick to Kubernetes. Kubernetes is great because for me, one advantage that people don't talk is you have immutable infrastructure, same code dependencies in dev and pros. This is not Kubernetes, it's actually containers. But another great advantage is declarative. It's great Kubernetes that you define what you need to do, not how, and Kubernetes takes care of the rest. It's scalable, cost efficient, and the resources are very efficient, right? In a single VM, you can run multiple containers. There's a great ecosystem, lots of tools and frameworks. It supports cron jobs, stateful applications, even for big data processing or complicated actor systems for distributed systems. It's portable. That's a great advantage. So many CTOs, they go for Kubernetes because they allows them to migrate to different cloud providers or have a hybrid solution, and it's open standard. The main problem of Kubernetes is difficult to learn. Kubernetes is not easy. It requires a lot of knowledge from a true DevOps culture. Basically, you need knowledge of networking, you need knowledge of storage, you need all this operational knowledge, but also the development. It's hard to deploy it out of the box. So even if you can do it on-prem, and there are solutions like Red Hat OpenShift, either they are expensive or then you need to rely on cloud providers. So although it's very portable, there are not many companies who actually migrate Kubernetes from cloud provider every year, right? Because it's not that easy. So you tend usually to deploy Kubernetes usually on a cloud provider. It requires more expertise. So again, hiring talent for in a Kubernetes environment is a lot harder than a serverless approach. And then that although you have a great ecosystem, there are too many options. Sometimes they are immature, and it's hard to keep up to date. So you have to be very careful. That's another problem I find with Kubernetes. So when you should consider serverless, and these bullet points are very important, but that doesn't mean that because you meet one point that it means that you have to go serverless. Usually when if most of these make sense to you, then you are probably should consider serverless, right? So for example, if your team are mainly developers with no operational experience, you don't have SREs, it's development based, you're a startup, or your skills are more on the development side, you don't have many operation teams, or you cannot find them, then that's a good option. It's time to market very important, and your resources are limited, serverless will get you there faster. If your product have many spikes and predictable load, this happen a lot in retail with sales, and need to scale fast, serverless is a good option for that. If you use very little or no resources at time, and that also points you to a pay-as-you-go model, right? So spikes and then periods of no usage, that's a great use of a pay-as-you-go model. Then just make sure also you can handle some spike in monthly bills, right? For me, this is very important. Startups have sometimes problems with cash flow, and maybe sometimes they are victims of their own success, meaning that they get suddenly lots of users, they do a big marketing campaign, they get loads of traffic, and suddenly they have a huge cloud bill that they don't have the cash yet to pay for. So just make sure you can support this type of changes also in the spikes on the monthly bills. And then you have limited use of languages. So depends on your cloud provider. Just make sure you use one of those. Another thing I've seen many times serverless in the JVM, still serverless is not the best option to run the JVM. Kubernetes is much better for that. So if you don't use Java or JVM, that's a good option. If you use Java or JVM, a language like Scala, it may not be the best option. Just also make sure that the use case can be implemented as a function, as a service. Again, if you have stream processing where it needs to be really low latency or stateful workload, it might not be the right case for you. Again, vendor lock-in, be careful. Although there are options, think about vendor lock-in for serverless. And of course, make sure for the serverless, especially for function as a service, that you are building event-driven applications, right? That's very, very, very important. Okay, for Kubernetes. So if you are migrating basically your existing service to the cloud, it's a great option. If your service already run on containers, or if you run on-prem or on a hybrid cloud and you want to avoid vendor lock-in, it's another option. It's great, especially when you have a predictable or steady load. That's actually happens a lot of time. So you saw that joke about keeping the Lambda warm. Many people go serverless, but they don't have any spike. They have a steady workload. And in this case, it's cheaper to run in Kubernetes. If you use a programming language that is not supported, then you cannot go serverless, so Kubernetes is a great option. Also, if you use low-level APIs and you need really control of your processes or stateful components or long-running tasks, or you build these complicated real-time distributed systems, or if you rely heavily on the JVM, especially for concurrency. Okay, and for your operations, if you have already a DevOps team, right, then Kubernetes fits nicely into that, right? Because it follows the DevOps culture. you need to have people that are very skilled on Kubernetes. You have to have a company that embraces the DevOps principles. So if you have a really separation between Dev and Ops, it may not be the best tool for you. You want to also take control on the resources to maximize performance and minimize cost. It's very, very good for in Kubernetes. You have your cluster and that's your cost. You don't have surprises. And if you need extra security, you want to secure your containers, and you have some extra requirement that serverless will not meet, then Kubernetes is a great option. So just to finish up, again, serverless and Kubernetes, they are not competing technologies. They are basically different, completely different. And it's all different use cases. And they can live together. That's very important, right? You could have serverless workloads. Sometimes serverless is great actually for CI/CD, to spin up things, to orchestrate different options. And then your main load could still work in Kubernetes. But I will be very careful with mixing them. Usually a company has a special type of workload. And basically you need to check which one works better for you, right? At the end, both approaches are a huge step forward in terms of maintainability, performance, and cost savings compared to regular VMs. You need to think about your business and how it can grow, your culture, and your goals. For me, this is very important. If you have the DevOps culture, you know, that points more to Kubernetes. If you just building more a front-end mobile applications, serverless could be a better options. And again, define your core values, guidelines, OKRs, processes for your company. Do not choose the platform first because you think it's best, and then try to solve your business problems on top of the platform you have chosen, right? Think about business first. Again, I suggest domain-driven design. Think how project your business goals, guidelines, and that will give you a clue on which option you should go with. And just to summarize, just think about serverless as event-driven, pay-as-you-go, no operation model, great for startups, time to market, or to orchestrate different, I would say, satellite workloads. So you may have your main platform, and for smaller jobs, serverless is great. And think about Kubernetes as avoid vendor locking, embrace DevOps, cost efficient. Again, in terms of cost efficient, both could be great options. Serverless could be great, but more cost efficient if you have sudden spikes and times where you don't have workload, and Kubernetes will be more efficient if you have a steady workload. Me, I moved from a company that was mainly based on serverless, AWS, to a company running Kubernetes, and I can say that on Kubernetes, more or less, it was 10 times more cost efficient than serverless for doing big data processing, right? And this has to do because nothing really can beat, for example, Go microservices running on Kubernetes. Go, as you know, is a language that's very efficient. You can run thousands of coroutines in basically a container that is 50 megabytes in size with a virtual size of 5 megabytes only. So in 5 megabytes, you can actually do real-time processing in a Go program, and that's very cost efficient, right? Using half of a vCPU and 100 or 200 megas of RAM. So Kubernetes can be very, very cheap to run, especially with long-term discounts, spot instances. It could be very, very cheap. So think about that also when making the decision. So that's it. Let's see if anybody has any questions. There's one, why DevOps cultures imply Kubernetes. It's mainly the other way around. You can have DevOps without Kubernetes. It's the culture of, but I asked that in another talk I gave. Kubernetes implies, because Kubernetes configuration lives in files, and that is usually with your code in a repo, in a Jet repo. It empowers that developers take care of their microservices. So usually how Kubernetes microservices looks like, you have in your repo, your code, your Jenkins files for CI/CD, and your Helm definition, right? for example, to package your configuration. So you have your code and your operational. You also put the graphs. So something that we do in AYLIEN, like me, when I develop a new service, I have to develop the graphs for Kibana, Grafana. I develop the health charts. It's all in the same code repository. I develop the service, I test it, and so on. So it really empowers that because of the declarative nature of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is, if you try to separate the Kubernetes configuration of services from the code, you'll see that it's a nightmare, right? It's very complicated. So that's very tricky, especially for CTOs or CEOs, if anybody's here. In terms of kind of cost efficiency, Kubernetes could be a lot cheaper, but just be careful that Kubernetes workforce is more expensive. Like serverless empowers a lot of JavaScript, which is great, or Python, but and Kubernetes basically can run, like in AYLIEN, will run complicated workloads in Scala, Akka, JVM. So finding people, we are having a lot of issues with that. So I hope this answered the question.
Okay, I think there's another one that has,
Yeah.
I know it came up previously. I've seen people who've kind of gone down, there's sometimes the argument of whether you go just pure serverless or pure Kubernetes to kind of on-prem versus the serverless architectures. Is there any sort of viable solution whereby you could do a combination of both? And is there any merits that might well be kind of a middle ground if people are unsure as to which way to go?
Yes, exactly. That's what I said in my last slide. Depends. You can run different workloads. I've seen it in companies where they may have. Imagine their legacy system was migrated to microservices, then to Kubernetes that's running on the cloud, and then you start building your, I call them satellite applications, like web app applications, dashboards for big data, all these other applications or orchestration pipelines, and then you start using serverless. That's very common, right? Or if you need to build a new app, like for example, many companies now, because of the current environment, they have to pivot their business and build something really quick, time to market. And maybe they are already running in Kubernetes, but they decide to build that on serverless.
Perfect. You mentioned there as well in the presentation, there were some services that were obviously more cost effective, others which were going to ramp up the cost pretty quickly. Is there any that you would advise that would nearly be integral to anything that you would be looking if you were going for pure serverless, or anything that would jump out ones to kind of steer or move away from, or ones to definitely kind of take advantage of?
Yes, sadly, I have some. It depends on many cases, right? So, but I could say if you are building serverless mainly as a backend for mobile, web, and you spec a lot of loads, it could be, if in that case, if you don't have spikes and you have a steady workload, that points more on Kubernetes. Talking about websites and mobile apps, if you have spikes, serverless will be cheaper. So that's easy. If you spec, like if you are more in retail, serverless could be better. And I wouldn't recommend serverless for big data type of streaming. AWS has services running to a pass like AWS Glue, Kinesis. Those services, we had issues where they become quite expensive. I have another question. Thoughts on Knative. Knative is basically open source function as a service that runs very well in Kubernetes. Really recommending. It's now integrated in Google Cloud. It's called Cloud Run. And the problem I see is still, compared to serverless, you still need to manage service accounts and the whole security around Kubernetes. So it's the Kubernetes way. So it doesn't integrate as nicely yet with other cloud providers. Not like with Lambda that you select the triggers, the permissions, and then you can call DynamoDB right away, right? So still Knative provides that scale to 0. But it's not fully event-driven yet. That's my personal opinion. Of course, people will disagree. Some people will disagree. But But for me, I just think the function as a service at the moment, Kubernetes is scaled containers to 0 more than proper event driven.
Brilliant. I can give a couple of followers here, Javier, who are looking to see if you'll be making your slides public or if we could send them on at some point. Will you be able to share those with the guys? I'm sure.
Exactly, yes. No problem
Brilliant.
at all.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Javier, thanks very much. We'll probably catch up with you again in a bit once Carl gets through his presentation, and I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions to ask for him to see how he got on in his very peaceful and smooth transition towards serverless architectures. So thanks very much, Javier.